If thin privilege actually exists, we have to acknowledge the existence of fat privilege as well. And when there is equal but different privilege on both sides of the equation, they cancel each other out, and what we are left with is simply a choice. Yo-yo and hello, my name is Lydia, and on today's episode of my 25-pound yo-yo, I want to talk about thin privilege, what it is, and why I think that it's bunk. It does not exist. Now, I have heard many other arguments against thin privilege, including things like, oh, it's not something that you were born with it's something that you can change, and isn't it just a consequence due to your bad choices that you made before? And although I agree with most of that, that is not the only reason, or even the major reason why I think that thin privilege doesn't exist. And that is because we are glossing over what fat privilege is. If fat privilege did not exist, it would be a no-brainer. Everybody would just choose to do the right things to be thin. But there is fat privilege. The fat privilege of eating whatever you want, whenever you want, however much you want. Just that privilege of not caring about your body and just eating. Now, so many thin, fit people would love to be able to gorge themselves. So many times I have to tell myself to stop eating because it just tastes so good. But I do stop eating because I value other things more. No other oppressed group has this luxury. None of them. None of them have something that they want to hold on to so dearly that's preventing them from not being underprivileged. Let me use an example to illustrate. I'm going to select people from different groups that are oppressed. Now, there, of course, are so many other groups that exist of people that are oppressed, but I'm going to zero in on 4 distinct categories to try to illustrate this better. We're going to meet Mary. Mary is a Black woman that lives in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and she is underprivileged because of her race. Next, we have Scott, and Scott is a white male who is disabled, and this disability occurred due to him driving drunk and getting into a car accident and then thus losing the use of his legs. Next, we have George. George was born into poverty, and he's currently still living in a poor neighborhood and is trying to find a way to get out of poverty. And then we have Anne, who is an obese woman who was not born obese, but over time gradually started to gain weight until she got herself into a morbidly obese condition, and she also has no other known medical issues. So I'm going to ask these 4 different people questions and see what makes them similar and what makes them different. Now, the first one would be, were you originally born into privilege, but then lost that privilege later on in life? Anne was born into privilege, but then she decided to get fat, and then she lost that privilege, as well as Scott, who was able-bodied, but then after his car accident, he became disabled and then thus underprivileged. Whereas Mary and George, well, they were born into their conditions and had no say in it. So Mary was born Black and George was born poor. The next question I'll ask is, with very hard work, is it possible to escape your situation and get the privilege that you desire? So here we can see that both Anne and George have a way out. Now for George, it's not just hard work, it's hard work meets opportunity meets luck. But it is possible. We have heard of rags to riches stories. So George could come out of being poor with some hard work and luck. For Anne, she could come into a healthy body weight if she wanted to diet and exercise. Whereas with both Mary and Scott, nothing Mary can do can change the fact that she's Black, and nothing that Scott can do can change the fact that he is handicapped. The next question I'm going to ask is the underprivilegedness the result of something self-inflicted? So here we can see that both Anne and Scott have a yes, whereas George and Mary would be a no. George didn't do anything to be poor. He was born poor. Mary didn't do anything to become black. She just is black. Whereas Anne had to eat a lot to become obese. And Scott, he decided to drive drunk, and then he is suffering the consequence of that and got into a car accident and now doesn't have use of his legs. Now, the last question I'm going to ask is there a different but equal privilege that you currently hold that you would need to exchange for the privilege that you are asking for? And here is where we see that everybody says no except for Anne. And this is why I say there is no such thing as thin privilege, because Anne has that privilege of eating, and she does not want to let go of it. So if she wanted to have all of the privileges that being thin would give her, she would need to relinquish the privilege of eating whatever the fuck she wants. Whereas if we look at it with everybody else, Mary would like the privilege of shorter voting lines, the type that exist in the white neighborhoods. Scott would like to be able to go for a hike with his friends in the woods. George would like to be able to pay his bills. There is nothing that they have that they would have to give up in order to get those privileges. Whereas Anne, she wants all the benefits of being thin. She wants to find clothing in her size. She wants to be comfortable on an airplane. Well, she can have those things. But in order to have those things, she has to give up her food privilege. So for me, this is not an example of thin privilege. It's an example of fat entitlement. Anne feels entitled to have all the things that thin people have without giving up the thing that thin people do, which is controlling what they eat. Anne wants to literally have her cake and eat it too. And that simply is not fair. I have a similar situation with my children. I have 2 kids, and they each get an allowance. One of them likes to spend their allowance right away. Spend it on candy, on toys, on clothing. As soon as the allowance is in her hands, it's gone. Whereas my other child, well, he likes to save his allowance and save up for something larger. So about a year ago, my son decided to empty out his bank account with all of his saved up allowance to go out and buy a Nintendo Switch. And boy, was my daughter mad. There was a lot of tantrums, and that's not fair. How come he gets a Switch and I don't get a Switch? I can't believe it. That's not fair. So she was shouting that he had a privilege because he bought a Switch. But then I had to remind her, you had the same opportunity. The same opportunity. You both got money. You chose to take your money and spend it right away. He chose to put it in the bank. So when he decides to take out that money to buy something big, that is up to him. He's allowed to do that because he made the sacrifice of not spending the money before, and then he earned the right to buy the Switch. You complaining and claiming he has privilege is actually you being entitled. So this is the mistake that my children made. And remember, they are just kids. The thing is, my children were able to learn this. And my daughter was like, oh, yeah, that's right. I did have the money. I chose not to save it. And that's why he has money and I don't. So now she's opened up a different savings account and she's actually saving towards buying a gaming station. And she's putting aside her money and she has learned from that. She's not screaming privilege. She realized that she was behaving entitled. So if my children can figure out this whole entitlement thing, why is it that the fat acceptance community can't? There is no such thing as thin privilege. It's simply a choice. And if you keep on insisting that there is thin privilege on something that is just a choice, that means that every single choice that we make has privilege attached to it. Oh, I'm wearing a tank top and you're wearing long sleeves. You have sleeves privilege. Oh, I'm eating an apple and you're eating an orange. You have orange privilege. You can take any decision where there's an equal privilege and turn it into a cause. And this is ridiculous. Now you might be wondering, well, what gives me the right to say that they are equal privileges? The privilege of having a thin body and the privilege of eating whatever you want. Well, I actually didn't decide that. It's the whole fat community that did. Because if it wasn't equal, we wouldn't have so many fat people. Now, would we? I like to think about it as something that you would put on a would you rather card. And the reason why I say it that way is because those questions are asked where you don't really know where someone's going to fall. You don't know that most people would say this versus that. That's why it's a would you rather question. The other groups of people, would you rather stand in line to vote for 5 hours or be in and out in 5 minutes? That's a no-brainer. Would you rather have the money to go on vacation or struggle to pay your bills? That's not really a question now, is it? But in this instant, it totally is a would you rather. Would you rather be able to easily find your clothing size in most stores and be able to fit comfortably in movie theater seats and airplanes and buses? Or would you rather eat whatever you want, whenever you want, and how much ever you want? You see, when you put it that way, there's a lot of people that say, well, I want the thin privileged stuff, but I don't want to give up the other stuff. So that's why I'm saying it's equal privilege. If it wasn't equal privilege, it would be a no-brainer where everyone would choose one thing and then there would be privilege. But if there's equal privilege, they cancel each other out. There is no privilege, and then it is just a choice. So that's a little food for thought. And until next time, yo-yo, and let's go.